Thank you. Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be back in Australia, to be back at the Opera House. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. As Anne's just said, I've written a novel, but I don't want to talk particularly specifically about the novel. Please buy it after if you feel inclined. But what I really want to do is to talk about some of the ideas behind the novel. And sometimes people say to me, you know, why did you even bother to write a novel? I thought you were supposed to be a non-fiction writer. And the reason I wrote a novel is that I believe that many of our ideas on love come from reading novels, also songs, films, etc. But essentially, we are very shaped by the love narratives that we read. And this could seem a little cruel. We tend to think that we love spontaneously, that we're not influenced by what we read and by what we see, but I think that we are. We love within a very historical, social context. There's that lovely biting aphorism from La Rochefoucauld. He says, there are some people who would never have fallen in love if they hadn't heard there was such a thing. That's a little extreme, but you get the idea that really when we love, we are taking a lot of our cues from the outside world. We honor certain feelings that we experience because other people are telling us to honor them. We suppress other feelings because people have told us not to pay them particular attention. Now, we are nowadays firmly in a very distinctive era in the history of love. We are living in the era of romanticism. Romanticism is an intellectual movement that began in the salons, studies, garrets of European poets, novelists, writers in the middle end of the 18th century. And nowadays, even if you've never heard of a single romantic poet or novelist from any garret in old Europe, and you're just having your love life here in Sydney, you are influenced, because we all are, by romanticism. So whether you don't necessarily know about it or feel it or touch it, it is all around us in the ether. We are living, ladies and gentlemen, in the era of romanticism. Now, what does romanticism tell us about love? It has a very distinctive set of arguments about what love is like, what we should expect from love, and how relationships should go. And let me run you through a few of those romantic assumptions. I think the first and most central assumption is that for all of us out there, there is most definitely a soulmate. We may not have met them already. We may be swiping left, right, furiously in order to try and locate them. They exist, and eventually, if we keep going hard enough, we will find them. And when we find them, our soul will fuse with theirs. All areas that had previously been confused and lonely will be redeemed. We will no longer feel ourselves wordless, agonized, melancholic before the mysteries of existence. We have found a true friend, and loneliness will be banished. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the person waiting for us somewhere out there, the soulmate. How are we going to find this person? Well, big question. The dominant answer of romanticism is by instinct. You know, for most of history, the way that people were matched up was by the elders of the community, by parents, by other people than the couple themselves. It was what was known as a marriage of reason. And there were reasonable criteria, so-called reasonable criteria, which is maybe that you had a goat and they had a sheep, or you had a plot of land and they had a adjoining plot of land, or whatever it was. And it was on that basis that these so-called dynastic marriages were made. And that was the way in which people have married for thousands of years, really since the beginning of time. But along comes romanticism and says, no, we are going to marry in a different way. We are going to marry by instinct. And the instinct is that somewhere along the line you will feel a special feeling, very, very special feeling inside, a kind of excitement. And you don't know when it will strike you. Maybe you're at the bar, maybe you're at the swimming pool, maybe you're just waiting in line for something, but you'll spot somebody, and without necessarily knowing too much about them, indeed the romantics were quite keen on it happening without knowing anything about them other than simply seeing their face, you will know that's your soulmate. And so that special feeling has become venerated, and first of all, you don't question that special feeling. So, you know, if you said to your parents, I've met somebody, and they go, oh, right, tell me what, you just say, I've had that special feeling, and everyone just, you know, the waters part, and the couple moves forward, because there's been that special feeling. So once the special feeling is announced, you know, you raise the flag, the special feeling has happened, and that's terrific. Of course, if you don't feel that special feeling, it's a bit embarrassing. Is something wrong with me, etc. So you may start to fake the special feeling. You kind of like someone, but you fake that you've had this romantic special feeling. And so romanticism is very into the notion of the crush and the immediate sensation of certainty that you have met someone very special. Romanticism goes hand in hand with the developments of the railways in Europe in the 19th century. And an awful lot of these meetings happen on trains in fiction. Even in Russian fiction alone, you could build a library of stories in which the hero and heroine meet on a train. And without much knowledge, as I say, just the sight maybe of an ankle, an elbow, the curvature of a cheek, you will know that's a soulmate. And that's how it begins. So that's how you're going to find your life partner. The Romantics are very keen on the notion of happily ever after, that love is not just a passing phase, it is forever, till death do us part. Strikingly, many of the Romantics die quite young, and so often the story begins, couple fall madly in love, and then someone with a little cough, and then tuberculosis, and it's a beautiful love story, but it does end after a few months. But nevertheless, it's forever in a sense. And Romantics are also very keen on suicide, ending things dramatically. So death has a curious relationship with love in the Romantic point of view. The other essential thing about the Romantics is that generally no one really has a job. None of the Romantics really have jobs, so they can devote a lot of time to love. And they're spending a lot of time just in each other's arms, and also going for walks. Nature is incredibly important for the Romantics. Going out into nature for long, long walks. Very particular places, waterfalls, very romantic place. Also places where the ocean meets the land, dramatic cliffs, pounding of seas, very quintessentially romantic places. Romantic times of day. Dusk is a quintessentially romantic time, especially when you've got a layer of clouds and the underside of the clouds are lit up by the shafts of the dying sun, turning the sky a purpley, pinky hue. Very romantic sort of moment, a moment to enforce love through the help of nature. The Romantics have a very distinctive take on sex. People obviously have been having sex for all of human history, and there's been some love. But what the Romantics do is a remarkable fusion of love and sex. They basically consecrate sex as the summit of love and the ultimate expression of love. So far from being merely a mechanical action, it becomes the most sincere expression of your feelings for another person, almost divine expression of tenderness for another person. Very beautiful. It has a slight drawback, which is that it turns adultery into a tragedy, a catastrophe. Because if you believe, as the Romantics do, that sex is the crowning expression of love, then any interest outside of the couple will be catastrophic in nature. And that's why almost every great novel of the 19th century in Europe is about adultery, in one form or another, starting with Flaubert's Madame Bovary, moving on to Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and on and on. People have been having adultery for all of human history. It's been happening all the time. But what's new is the weight that's put on it. And as I say, it is a violation of everything that the Romantics believe that love is. Now, I should say that many of these romantic ideas are very beautiful. They're very exciting, and we all live through them, and it would be naive to some way dismiss them as irrelevant to the way we live. They are everywhere, and they are at the center of how we approach love. But I also want to insist that Romanticism has been a catastrophe for our capacity to have good long-term relationships. And if we want to have a chance of succeeding at love, we will have to be disloyal to many of the romantic emotions that got us into relationships in the first place. Romanticism has spelt trouble for our capacity to endure and thrive in long-term relationships. Why do I say that? Well, let me run you through a few of the areas that I believe that Romanticism has spelt difficulty for us in relationships. So Romanticism replaced an earlier vision of human nature, which tended to stress how fragile, broken, and very sinful we all were, an old Christian idea. And Romanticism comes along and dismisses this attitude as hopelessly pessimistic and insists instead on the purity and good nature of every human being. For the Romantics place an awful lot of emphasis on children. And children for the Romantics are always good. They're always sweet. It begins with Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the mid-18th century. The child is the purest expression of humankind, and the only thing that makes a child bad is society. So only society corrupts children, but basically it's a sign that we are born good. And the older view, which was associated with Christian theologians like St. Augustine, which stressed the fundamental sinfulness. You know, St. Augustine argued that all of us bear within us the original sin of Adam. And therefore all of us, it's good to speak like this at a pulpit to an audience, but all of us are sinners or potential sinners, and therefore need to be at the mercy of others and of the divine in order, I'm a secular Jew, but the divine, in order to endure life. Now, Romanticism does away with this and says to us that all of us are angelic by nature. The interesting thing is that Romanticism coincides with the decline in organized religion. So just as religion is declining, Romanticism rises and is in many ways a replacement, a secular alternative. So when we get together in love, you know, what's fascinating is the beginning of the use of the word angel to refer not to those winged creatures up in the sky, but to refer to other human beings. And there's a marked increase of this in the age of Romanticism. And nowadays, of course, many of us will cheerfully call our partner angel. So we are all of us, in a sense, through the lens of Romanticism, good people. Our wings have been temporarily put aside, but essentially we're pretty perfect people, not particularly tainted by original sin. Now, I think this is highly troubling for relationships because it leads to that absolute problematic dynamic within any relationship, which is self-righteousness. If you think that you're quite perfect and that your partner is quite perfect too, that's trouble anyway. And if you start a relationship, you'll soon start hitting upon things which will lead you to think that actually maybe they're not that perfect. Now, what do you do with that feeling if you're operating against an ideology that says that everyone, and that your partner particularly, is by nature good? Very unhelpful backdrop in which to negotiate the troubles of relationships. It's far better, I believe, to insist that all of us are, in various ways, deeply, and I don't mean this in any way in an insult, deeply crazy. I may not know exactly how you're crazy. I can tell you later how I'm crazy. I won't. Well, I might. But basically, all of us, none of us get through the gauntlet of early childhood, adolescence, etc., with our sanity entirely intact. We are all of us warped, distorted in very distinctive ways. It may take us 50 years to work out exactly how we're distorted, but we are distorted. And this is a fundamental piece of knowledge which we should be taking with us into relationships, with a big warning sign over us. Now, why are we so unable to conceive of ourselves as damaged and crazy, and therefore so prone to self-righteousness? Well, part of the problem is that all of us have very low levels of self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is really, really hard to come by, partly because there's almost a conspiracy of silence around us. People don't quite tell us what they think of us. And therefore, we go through life where the average person who's met us for 20 minutes has a deeper insight into many of our flaws than we might achieve over a lifetime. Why don't people tell us this? Well, there's really no motive for them to tell us this at many stages. Our parents are not going to tell us certain things that they know. They can see things about us, but they're not going to tell us because they're very kind, they wish us well. It's not really their business. They're not going to go into it, and maybe they're blinded by their own affection for us. There's our friends. Well, of course, our friends are not going to tell us certain things about our characters, the ways in which we're difficult in particular, because all they really want from us is a pleasant evening out. They don't care. You really have to care about someone to be bothered to go into all that stuff about their true character. And our friends, certainly, they can't be bothered. They don't like us enough. So it leaves then that other category, our exes. Well, our exes, you could expect that they will, somewhere along the lines, have told us, but the thing, on the whole, it's not really worth their while either. And so they tend to take their leave by saying things like they need to spend more time on their own, they need to develop their character, they'd like to go traveling. Nonsense. Of course not. They see certain things about you, but again, they're not going to go through it. They can't be bothered. They just want out. Let somebody else sort that out. So the thing is that we go through life not really knowing. I mean, it's very tender and poignant how sometimes some of us feel, probably some of you in the audience feel, that broadly speaking, you're quite easy to live with. I mean, does anyone here think that they're, kind of broadly speaking, easy to live with, if only they met the right person? Like, there are a few people, that's a very a poignant combination, whereby a very romantic combination. I spent my early 20s absolutely convinced that the only thing that was missing was really the right person. And if so long as I met the right person, then all would be well. So this notion that we might be easy to live with is deeply misleading and should be stamped out. Of course, we're not. Everybody from close up is trouble. And we need to put this in mind, bear this in mind. If I was running the world, one of the key questions that we would always ask each other on an early dinner date, without anything pejorative being meant by it, is, how are you crazy? So I'm crazy like this, how about you? And that we'd be expected to have a really thoughtful and kind of well thought through, non-defensive, non-hysterical answer to that question to be able to share with another person. Think how much time we would save. We don't need people in relationships to be perfect. We need them to have a handle on their imperfections and to be able to warn us and prepare us for the more noxious sides of their personalities outside of those critical moments when those personality distortions have deeply upset us. But it's very hard to do. And most of the time, we come upon discoveries about other people at moments when those discoveries have pained us deeply, and therefore we are not likely to be in any way sympathetic. So the calm explanation of one's insanities to another person is one of the greatest gifts. And I think one of the best wedding presents that any of us could give one another is a large book called, My Insanities, that you would give. Each person would give My Insanities to their partner, and think how much time I think we would save. The other thing that romanticism really gets wrong is this emphasis on instinct, right? So, the old marriage of reason, marriage by the family, etc. And then, the romantics tell us there's this marriage by instinct, that special feeling. Well, the thing about it is that, you don't need to accept or even know much about psychoanalysis and psychotherapy to just take on board the one key central idea of psychotherapy, which is the way that we love as adults is a reflection and deeply connected to the way that we learned about love as children. That is the foundation stone of psychotherapy. So you look at how you are in adult relationships, and there are a million connections that you can make with how we learned about love as children. Now, the problem with this is that the way that we learned about love as children is likely to have been a bit problematic. It's likely that we received affection, certainly, but that in one way or another, without necessarily meaning to, our parents did us a great disservice. In some ways, they damaged us, without necessarily meaning to. And this has very particular consequences for our capacity to find love as adults. Because often what we're trying to do in adult love is re-find a kind of love that we knew as children. But the kind of love that we knew as children was not necessarily problem-free. Indeed, it was very particularly and interestingly distorted and laden with all sorts of difficulties. And these become the new criteria which we search for in our adult partners. So when people say that in love, what they're looking for is someone to make them happy, to make them content, to bring them happiness, we can't necessarily believe them. Really, what we're searching for when we search for an adult partner is someone who feels familiar. And very often, the kind of people that we meet don't feel familiar in the level of care, generosity, and goodness that they're bringing to us. It just feels a little bit odd. We think, I don't necessarily feel at home with this kind of treatment. You know how it is when you sometimes set up a friend and on paper, two people are completely perfect, the two CVs match exactly, and you set them up, and then, you have hopeful expectations for the date, and then they come back to you, and you say, how did it go? How did the date go? And they say, I don't know, they're really nice. We've got so much in common in a way, all our interests, we do all the same sports and read the same books, etc., but I don't know, something was missing. And I don't know, some chemistry, something. And very often the thing is that our unconscious has recognized that this so-called very nice person is perfect, except for they won't make us suffer in the way that we expect to be made to suffer in love. So they've got to be dismissed. They're just not going to make me unhappy in the way that I've learned to expect that love should make me unhappy. And, we know this situation in its most extreme forms. Somebody who can only take someone, who will hit them, who will strike them. But even without the extremes of violence, there are many ways in which we are attracted to people, not so much for their positive sides, but because they feel, as I say, familiar in the degree to which they will frustrate certain of our aspirations for ourselves. There's another problem with romanticism. And that's really to do with the idea of honesty. Romanticism had an extremely high regard for the concept of honesty. And that a relationship, the whole point of a relationship is that you can be honest with another human being. Most of the time, we've got to lie all the time about who we are, what we feel, how are you, I'm fine, we're breaking down inside, etc. We're all in tears inside, we're broken, we've got to put up a front. That's what society demands of us. But finally, we can meet someone, and with them, the drawbridge can come down, the walls can come down, and we can be ourselves. And there are wonderful moments in the early moments of love, in the early phase of love, when we really do feel that we have found someone who can accept all of us and take on board everything that we are. We need to have no more secrets. We can be properly ourselves. And the truth is that being yourself, fully yourself, around another human being is a treat that you should probably spare anyone that you claim to love, because it's really a little problematic. Now, often it goes a bit like this. Look, let's be honest, I think no kids in the room. Often it's a little bit around sex. So in the early days of love, you've been a bit lonely in all areas, including sex, and you meet somebody and you say, do you like, that thing that you could do, like with a rope and like handcuffs? Like imagine have you ever been interested? And they go, wow, yeah, I've always wanted to try that, and but I've never dared tell anyone. And there's that wonderful sense of intimacy based on there no longer needing to be shame. We no longer need to be ashamed of ourselves. We can be ourselves in the bedroom, etc. And this is a very ecstatic discovery, and it really makes us feel so powerful in the world, because we no longer have to be a hunchback figure. We can now go out into the world and feel that some of our darkest secrets have acceptance and endorsement from another human being. This lovely phase tends to last about 3 months until normally the moment goes like this. Not the same for everybody, but a version of this tends to happen. So you've been sharing everything, you've been sharing the thing and the handcuffs, and it's all been fun. And then you're sitting in a cafe with your lover, with whom you've opened your soul, and they've opened their soul, and you spot a really quite interesting member of the waiting team, and you go, see the waiter over there? Like, wouldn't it be fun if, the thing with the thing that we like do? Imagine if they got involved, we asked them to get involved, and gave them a number, and then they could come, and then you got watching, and then you turn to your partner, and rather than being this kind of open, cheerful person, they actually look in quite a big state of distress, and they look kind of unhappy and miserable. And you go, wow, I better stop right there. And you're at a fork in the road. And one fork in the road leads to the path of honesty, and another path leads to the path of love. And you've got a choice to make. You've got a choice to make. Are you going to carry on this anecdote, this fantasy, or are you just going to shut up? And most of us are going to shut up at that point. And that's the beginning of a very fundamental moment when we realize that, of course, we cannot be entirely ourselves, not because we're trying to retain a nasty secret from our partner, but because in the name of love, we cannot be entirely ourselves. We have to accept the role of editing, because the full disclosure of who we are and what we are at every moment to another human being will probably destroy them. And therefore, we need, in the name of love, to hold back and to edit a lot. None of this romanticism prepares us for. Indeed, it makes it look like a betrayal. So it sets up it's a very, very unhelpful backdrop in which this scenario happens, because romanticism insists on authenticity. It's by being totally authentic that you are true to love. Anything else is a betrayal of love. And, well, the facts on the ground are seriously, I believe, in conflict with that romantic commandment and cause us a lot of difficulties. I'm not through with my reservations about romanticism. Another thing about romanticism that it never really talks about is romanticism never really talks about the practical side of life. In the 19th century, no romantic poet, writer, artist, etc., ever mentions laundry. There's absolutely no mention of the fact that every couple who's been together any amount of time will have to spend a lot of time doing laundry, housework, cleaning, raising children, etc. This just goes unmentioned. And this causes us real difficulties, because it sets up an expectation that, intelligent, sensitive, soulful people don't really bother about these things. And therefore, that there's no particular emphasis on making an accommodation, a preparation for some of the difficulties that might come in this area. So at some point in a relationship, a version of this happens, this kind of scenario happens. Not exactly this, but a version of this happens, which is that a couple who, are very much committed to love and, disagree with their parents and some of their more petty attitudes to things like, etc., where the salt and pepper should go, and etc. They will suddenly have an argument in the bathroom that goes a bit like this. One of the couples will say, what's that towel doing there? And the other person goes, I just had a shower. You go, yeah, but what's it doing on the floor? And you go, yeah, well, I just threw it on the floor because I got to go and meet Bill. And you go, no, I know you've got to meet Bill, but what's it doing on the floor? And the other one goes, well, how do you mean what's it doing on the floor? It's just on the floor. And suddenly there's a kind of new tone of impatience, basically because both partners think that they're very, very clever and they're not petty. They're not going to sort of argue about petty things like towels on the floor. That's, again, they associate that with their grandparents or something. If you're a true romantic, you don't worry about these things. You don't make no accommodations. You are too clever to have this sort of argument. And when two people are convinced that they're too clever to have this sort of argument, you know the argument will be bitter. And so very often there is no accommodation with this aspect of life. Think of poor Madame Bovary in Flaubert's novel. Madame Bovary has been brought up in ideas of love drawn from romantic fiction. So she believes that love is all about guys on horseback and castles and walks through the mist, etc. And then she gets married to this quite nice, but pretty ordinary, regular kind of guy, but on the whole, okay. And suddenly she realizes that a lot of her time has got to be spent doing the laundry, organizing the milk and the cheese, and sitting down with her husband while he's doing the accounts, and she's supposed to be organizing the kind of domestic rota in the evenings, and he's reading the newspaper. And she thinks that her life has gone terribly wrong, that it's a disaster. What has happened? She thought that she was marrying for love, and now she's ended up with this kind of domestic situation. And these doubts unleash a series of processes in her mind which will lead eventually to her suicide and death. That essentially the belief that the practical side of life has no place in a good love life is central to romanticism and a disaster for our chances of love. So towels, more on that in a minute. The other thing that the Romantics very much believe is the Romantics believe that you shouldn't necessarily talk too much to your lover, and that talking is often a sign of not really understanding somebody. So very privileged space is given in Romanticism to that account that we sometimes get at the beginning of relationships, that two people have understood one another without needing to talk all the time. So people will say things like, it was amazing, we were there, we were by the waterfront, we were chatting, and then, sometimes we were just quiet because we just understood, we just knew. I would say one thing and it was amazing. He knew, he'd been there before, she understood. It's like we had traveled immediately down the same path. We don't need to explain ourselves in the way that I had to in that horrible last relationship. In this one, I could be myself, and we're a bit wordless. And the Romantics generally believe that too much analysis, too much putting of words on top of feelings is a bad thing. A quintessential Romantic belief is that you destroy feelings and emotions by thinking too much about them. I don't know if anybody in the audience feels, some people feel this, that if you think too much, you break things. That they're thinking too much is, I should have weeded those people out, but a few people have come here nevertheless. This is a disaster for a philosopher. It's like, what? Hang on a minute. Nevertheless, there are people, Romantics, I'm being nasty, but look, we all have that feeling sometimes that words can break things. Now, and so in a way, one of the nicest stories of love that Romantics tell us is intuitive understanding of one person by another without the medium of words. Again, over the long term, a catastrophe. Short term, charming, long term catastrophe. One of the things that it leads to is an outbreak of sulking. Romanticism was responsible for a worldwide enormous increase in the prevalence of sulks. Now, what is a sulk? A sulk is a feeling of hurt with another person, a wound that the other person has given you, that you are not going to explain to them for the simple reason that they're supposed to love you. And if they love you, they're supposed to know. So, of course, you could explain what's wrong with you, but if you had to explain, that would be a proof they didn't love you, because love is by its nature wordless. True love is wordless. And that's why Let's say you're coming back from the party where that offensive thing happened, and you're kind of silent in the car deliberately. You're not going to say what happened because you're a romantic and they should know. And they say, maybe they're making a few attempts and they go, look, is anything wrong? Nope. And then so you go up, you go up the stairs, you go home, you go to your apartment, and they say, come in the bedroom, and you go, no. And you go into the bathroom, you bolt the door, and they say, come on, Striggers. And they're knocking at the door going, come on, just tell me what it is. And you go, mm-mm. And the reason is that as a romantic, you believe that a true lover should be able to intuit the contents of your soul through the bathroom panel door, through the surface of your body and into your interior. And they should know. So why would you ever bother telling them? So this is a disaster because, unfortunately, even the most well-meaning people simply cannot understand all of us. They can understand bits of us, how we felt maybe when we were humiliated by our father at an early age, or how it felt to join a new school at a certain point or whatever. Some things they can just get, but a lot of things, particularly over the long term, just no one can get. You cannot expect the other person to be a mind reader. And yet Romanticism places the ability to mind read precisely at the kernel of its vision, the core of its vision of love. Deeply problematic, deeply problematic.